In a season that featured ebbs and flows of bubbling activity and lulls, the National Hurricane Center navigated several landfalling storms, including a noteworthy rainmaker to kick off the season here in South Florida. That was potential Tropical Cyclone 1. The storm, only after leaving major flooding in downtown Miami, went on to become the first named storm of 2022 in early June. But it didn't exactly set the tone for how the season would go. Joining me now is Daniel Brown from the National Hurricane Center with a look back on the twists and turns of the season. Dan, thanks for joining us this afternoon. Talk about at least the ups and downs of the season from your perspective, because of course we had impactful storms, but we also had some really quiet periods as well.
We typically have about 3 storms before we get to August. This year we did, but they were kind of early. They were early June, as you mentioned, and then we had a couple there in very late June, early July, and then we hit that big lull that lasted really over almost 2 months until we didn't have another storm until September. But things got pretty busy in September and October, and that's when we typically see most of the activity to occur in a given hurricane season.
It was almost like the switch flipped then when we got to that point in September. Let's go back quickly, though, to early June. And it's beneficial for the NHC to use the potential tropical cyclone terminology to get ahead of a storm. That was useful for what eventually became Alex. But do you think the general population, most of the users, say in Florida, are getting used to that and what it allows us to do? Or do you think we're still kind of navigating the roads of communication on that?
I think there's still some, lack of understanding of that term. But really, when you hear that, you just got to know that there's a tropical storm or hurricane that could form. And because of the risk to land, we go ahead and put up those watches and warnings to make sure everyone has the information they need to make those preparations. It's worked pretty well the last several hurricane seasons. We've had to do that. This one, with the case of potential Tropical Cyclone 1, it didn't form before it hit Florida. It actually formed east of the state, but it brought those impacts to us. So it heightened that awareness of the rainfall threat and even the wind threat in that event.
Okay, here we're seeing some video, Dan, of Hurricane Ian, a name that will certainly be retired as we go into the off season. Talk about some of the things that maybe you learned at the NHC and that we learn as residents of Florida about dealing with a storm of this type, of this magnitude, and some things we may be able to take away in the future from Ian.
This was a good case to make sure everyone's ready. Have those supplies ready. Know what you're going to do. There wasn't maybe quite as much lead time ahead of Ian. So we want to make sure folks know where they're going to go and ride out that storm. Have those friends and relatives available that you can go stay at if you live in a storm surge evacuation zone. Also, just want to point out, too, this hurricane season, we had impacts both at the beginning of the season with potential Tropical Cyclone 1 and Alex, and then all the way at the end of the season with Nicole. So it just shows here in Florida that we have to be ready both at the beginning of the season and then stay vigilant all the way through November. This is actually the second time in the last 3 years we've been impacted by a November storm.
All right, good information there. Dan, thanks for all that you did this season. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, and we'll definitely see you next season. John?
Well, thanks, Ryan. And listen, I know you're all watching this streaming, of course, on NBC6.com, but also let me invite you after the show, after the program is over, look at my article, which is a wrap-up of the season, a summary of the season, because it was very weird in how it started slow and got going late. And we also had some record-setting storms, Danielle and Fiona, probably, more than likely, fueled by the climate crisis. And you can read all about it in that article that's online. So we did not get through this list, right? We did not use any of the names that you see here because we only did 14 storms this year. You might recall the previous 2 years, for 2020 and 2021, we had a total collectively of 51 named storms between those 2 years. So, to have only 14, certainly the year behaved a lot more like you're supposed to see hurricane seasons behave, right? 14 storms, out of which, in this case, 8 became hurricanes. The average is 7. And of course, there's all the ones that formed. There was just discussion on air right now about Alex, potential Tropical Cyclone 1, right? And in June, and then Nicole all the way at the end of the season. Also a historic storm for Florida, Nicole was, because it came in as only the second November hurricane to ever strike the state of Florida. Listen, I want to make this point. Miami, Dade and Broward counties have been extremely fortunate over the last several years. Very, very, very lucky. These are the Category 4 and 5 hurricane landfalls over the last 6 years. And you can see the entire Gulf Coast and including the Florida Keys has seen an impactful major hurricane. But not along the east coast of Florida, definitely not Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Not direct. I know we got a big side swipe from Irma, but nevertheless, it would have been a lot worse had it struck directly here. There's no other reason than luck, but our luck someday may run out.
All right, John. Speaking of our counties here, even though we were spared from the brunt of Hurricane Ian, our area did see several tornadoes. Here's why. When a hurricane is over the ocean, there's very little friction because the water is smooth. So the winds down toward the ocean and the winds all the way up high in the sky are pretty much going the same direction and the same speed. But when a hurricane makes landfall, we begin to get friction and wind shear. The winds up high in the sky, they're still moving at the same rate they were over the ocean. But the winds down toward the ground, they start to interact with buildings and trees and in some places mountains. So the air up here is moving faster than the air down here. We call that wind shear. And that creates this vertical spin in the atmosphere. But we also have what's called updrafts. All areas of low pressure have air that starts at the ground and moves up into the sky. And that starts to take that twist and turn it horizontal. And that is how we get a tornado. But in order to get tornadoes in a hurricane, you have to be in a very specific spot. And when Ian was approaching us, all of South Florida was absolutely in that spot. So look at that right there. You saw that little spinning right there. See that? On the night that Hurricane Ian was approaching Florida, we were live on the air from just before 7:30 p.m. until just before 9 p.m., tracking 2 Broward County tornadoes as they were happening. Both were later confirmed by the National Weather Service, and there was extensive damage. At North Perry Airport in Hollywood, numerous planes were flipped or their wings torn off. And in Cooper City, an entire tree was ripped from the ground. So to understand where and how tornadoes happen with hurricanes, we need to look at the anatomy of a hurricane, and it starts with the eye of the storm, and that's that area of tranquility with quiet weather. But right around the eye is the most violent part of the storm. It's the eye wall. When we say there's a Category 4 hurricane making landfall, those Category 4 winds are going to be right here in that eye wall. And by the way, the eye wall can have tornadoes, but more tornadoes happen outside of the eye wall. And it's all about the 4 quadrants. If the storm is moving forward like this, and we draw a perpendicular line like this, we get 4 quadrants: left front, left rear, and right rear. In addition to that, the winds around low pressure are always counterclockwise, like that in the northern hemisphere. And that means the right front quadrant is where we have the worst weather and the highest threat for tornadoes. And why is that? The storm is moving forward like this, and those counterclockwise winds are also moving forward like this. So when this quadrant makes landfall, that's where we have the most violent weather. When Hurricane Ian was approaching South Florida, it never actually touched land here in South Florida, but all of us were in that right front quadrant, that box right there. We had the southerly winds, the storm surge, the rain, but we had the tornadoes. If we take a look at what happened with Nicole, much different situation. As bad as Nicole was for us, because the storm was coming in like this, the right front quadrant was up here. It never touched us. And that is why with Ian, and by the way, same thing with Irma back in 2017, in that right front quadrant, we had the tornadoes, and why with Nicole, all of that violent weather stayed completely north of our area.